We've actually known the name of the warrior god of Elbaf this whole time. Oda was hiding it in plain sight. Back in Little Garden, Dorian Broggie straight up told us the truth. The name of the warrior god of the giants is literally Elbaf. That's right, God Elbaf is the warrior god that Jarl is referring to, the rival of the sun god fruit user of the past. And the entire land of Elbaf is actually named after him. Today we're going to break down why the so-called warrior god Elbaf was never a literal god, but rather a real ancient giant who became so powerful with the Nidhogg fruit that the giants dubbed him a deity. And with this revelation, we finally have the answer to the truth behind both the impossibly gigantic mysterious swords that we've seen at both Elbaf and Wano, as well as the shocking truth behind Onigashima itself, as well as what actually happened between the Nidhogg and sun god fruit users at the climax of both the first and second world. But before we get into it, make sure to subscribe. But first, you can become your favorite admiral with the first ever Logia hoodies, the Magma hoodie, the Ice hoodie, and the Light hoodie. And the best part is, for the official launch of the Logia line, this month, all hoodies are $80 off. And on top of that, if you buy 2 hoodies, you get the third one free. These are 100% cotton, multicolored jacquard hoodies made to order with patterns literally knitted directly into the fabric. And right over the heart, you have the embroidered devil fruit detail. All hoodies are made to order and will take some time to ship. So go get your hoodies right now while they're $80 off, and you can buy 2, get 1 free before the deal runs out. Just hit the link in the description below. So that aside, to begin with, as I said, we've already been told the name of the warrior god that Jarl spoke of. Dorian Broggie explained it to us very clearly back in Little Garden. The warrior god is literally called God Elbaf. They explicitly tell us about this warrior god and his name right from the get-go. There really isn't anything at all to speculate about here. We have already been given the warrior god's name earlier in the story, straight from the giants' mouths, and so for the rest of the video, I will be referring to the warrior god as Elbaf, because that seems to be his name. Interestingly, I had also previously done videos on how I believed that Loki's fruit was likely going to be the warrior god Elbaf fruit, as that was the one other god aside from the sun god Nika that the giants of Elbaf had talked about. However, now it turns out that this theory was just one step off. Loki's fruit is not the Elbaf fruit, rather Loki's fruit is the fruit that Elbaf himself once had. And that makes a lot of sense, as it appears that this warrior god Elbaf was not in fact a literal god, but rather just an extremely strong warrior from the past who was then dubbed a god. This is an important distinction, whereas Nika and Nidhogg are genuinely mythical beings that so far only seem to exist in people's imaginations and can then be brought to life in the form of devil fruits, this giant warrior Elbaf seems to have been a real giant warrior, specifically the first ancient giant warrior to eat the Nidhogg fruit. And he was so strong in battle after eating this fruit that the giants started calling Elbaf a warrior god. This is essentially identical to how Ryuma was such a strong swordsman that the samurai began to refer to him as the sword god. This didn't mean Ryuma was literally a god, he was just such a strong warrior that people began to call him one. And the same thing happened with the giant Elbaf in ancient times, being called a warrior god. So essentially in One Piece we have mythical gods like the quote-unquote sun god and potentially the forest god and the earth god, etc., that are never established to be real. We're just told that through the power of people's imaginations they can be made real in the form of devil fruits. And then we have actual living warriors who were simply placed on a pedestal to the point that they became praised as gods. Ancient warriors like Ryuma and Elbaf who were so strong that they became immortalized in their respective cultures as gods. In fact, we still see this sort of thing happening in the One Piece world today, wherein normal people have such great feats that they end up being dubbed gods through the mythos that builds around them. This makes a lot more sense than there having been a literal god deity who also for some reason had to eat a Nidhogg devil fruit. Rather, Elbaf was simply a mighty ancient giant in the past, like Loki is today, who ate the Nidhogg fruit, and after eating said fruit, Elbaf became so strong that the giants began calling him a warrior god. This would also explain a lot about the origins of the island of Elbaf and its warrior culture in general. I doubt that the warrior Elbaf was named after the land of Elbaf, rather it's more likely it was the reverse. Considering how much the giants of Elbaf revere the warrior Elbaf, it's likely that the nation was named after him. In fact, it's even possible that Elbaf was the first king of the land, which would explain why his fruit was posthumously passed down through the royal family line. This would also explain why all of giant culture in the centuries that followed was based around warrior values. The giants named their land after this legendary warrior, and they built their culture around his values of being a warrior. Just as Harold cemented the values of peace and education in the giants today, Elbaf, possibly the first king of the land, may have cemented the values of war and battle in the giants that then held for the last millennia or so. So with this revelation that the warrior god Elbaf that the giants talk about in Little Garden was in fact a real warrior who wielded the Nidhogg fruit, now so much about the giants' history makes sense. And most notably, this also finally explains the impossibly gigantic sword planted in the Elbaf tree as well. So this sword has been a major mystery from the beginning of the arc. What being could possibly be large enough to actually swing a sword of this size? As large as the giants are, even they are like ants compared to this blade. And even ancient giants aren't even remotely close to big enough to wield it. On top of this, we've never had any hints that the giants or ancient giants can actually grow to be big enough to wield a sword this size. But now we finally got the answer. The only giant that could possibly grow big enough to wield this sword would be the wielder of the Nidhogg fruit. That's kind of the point of the Nidhogg fruit, as has been explained to us, to allow a giant to grow to absurdly large sizes that cannot be naturally achieved. So the previous wielder of the Nidhogg fruit would have been the only one to have reached the scale big enough to use the sword. It also makes sense that such a weapon would be necessary, since after eating the Nidhogg fruit, Elbaf would have become too big to be able to use his signature hammer, and so larger weapons would have had to be built for him. So putting it all together, the previous wielder of the Nidhogg fruit was the warrior Elbaf. It is his sword that we see planted in the land of Elbaf. The giants of the past named their land Elbaf after their legendary warrior, and over time they elevated him to a deity in their culture, a warrior god. After Elbaf passed away, the example that he had set established a permanent warrior culture for the giants, such that even many centuries in the far future, they still fight in his name. But the big question surrounding the warrior Elbaf is, why was he an enemy of the sun god? Well, there's actually a deeper layer to that. So to begin with, I don't believe that Elbaf fought the actual sun god, but rather Elbaf fought a wielder of the sun god fruit, either from the first world or Joy Boy himself in the second world. The reason that Elbaf's battles were likely with a wielder of the sun god fruit, and not the sun god himself, is because so far it doesn't seem likely that Oda is ever going to reveal if gods in One Piece are actually real or not. This is because a major point of the story that Oda tried to explain in great detail in Egghead Island is that whether or not gods actually exist does not matter. The message is that the magic in One Piece comes from people's dreams. Anything people believe in strongly enough can become reality in the form of devil fruits. As such, all mentions of the sun god arriving in the world in One Piece history so far are overwhelmingly likely referring to the Nika devil fruit user in each era, not a literal divine being showing up. And I break down in far greater detail in this video why all evidence points to this being the case, which I'm not going to repeat here, but you can watch that video after this one. But the idea that Elbaf fought a Nika fruit user in the past rather than a literal god makes a lot of sense, considering that Elbaf himself was just a mortal wielding the Nidhogg fruit. It would make far more sense for his rival to be someone who ate the counterpart sun god fruit. So bottom line, Elbaf fought either the Nika fruit user in the first world or Joy Boy, the Nika fruit user in the second world. However, the key is that Elbaf and the Nika fruit user were not truly enemies. Rather, the entire story so far tells us that Elbaf and the Nika fruit user were more so rivals in the past who likely became friends in the end. This goes to one of Oda's favorite patterns in the series, the notion that every king of the seas needs to have an equal rival. With Roger, we were initially told that Roger was the preeminent pirate of the past, the king of the seas, the lone pirate king. But then we got the revelation that there was in fact one, and only one pirate who was Roger's equal. The only other pirate who could stand toe-to-toe with him in his era, Whitebeard. And from then on, Roger and Whitebeard have always been framed as a dual pairing, the king and his counterpart. Roger and Whitebeard had legendary battles, of course, but they were not true enemies. If anything, underneath it all, they were actually friends. And if we go one generation further back, we see again an identical duo. Rox, and Herald. Rox was essentially the unofficial pirate king before Roger. Rox was the top dog of the pirate world during his era, and it's clearly established that it really was his era. But Rox was not alone at the top of the seas. There was one, and only one warrior who was his equal on the ocean, and that was Herald. They had their own legendary duels, of course, but underneath it all, again, they were, of course, lifelong friends. Rox even imagined a future where he and Herald teamed up to overthrow Emu and free the world, and Rox envisioned Herald having the Nidhogg fruit, while Rox himself would eat its counterpart, presumably the Sun God fruit. And that brings us to the Ancient Era, where now we have the reveal that the same thing happened in ancient times. Just as Roger had Whitebeard, just as Rox had Herald, so too did this ancient Nika fruit wielder, very possibly Joy Boy, have his own equal, Elbaf. If this is in fact Joy Boy, it makes the continuing parallel even more striking, as Joy Boy is considered to be the first ever pirate, meaning we essentially have had generation after generation of quote-unquote pirate kings with their equal rival. Joy Boy and Elbaf, Rox and Herald, Roger and Whitebeard, and now today we are obviously leading up to Luffy and Loki. The mural even already hints at this, with the two halves of the mural being divided up into great battles. The Sun God Fruit Wielders battle on one side, and the Nidhogg Fruit Wielders battle on the other side. Both of them together have to fight side by side to free the world. It is now essentially confirmed that Loki is the Whitebeard to Luffy's Roger. Only of course Luffy and Loki are set to far surpass that dynamic. Rather, their duo calls back to ancient times, the duo of Joy Boy and Elbaf. And so all of this context strongly suggests that the ancient era battle that we're being shown between Joy Boy and Elbaf does not feature them as true enemies, but rather equal rivals, as that has always been Oda's pattern with this type of dynamic throughout the story. And it's even further thematically supported by the arc that Elbaf was introduced, Little Garden, as this arc featured yet again the notion of two equal warriors who were rivals to one another, not true enemies, simply rivals in battle, who underneath it all would still join forces as friends when necessary. It would also simply not make any sense for Elbaf's culture if the warrior god Elbaf were truly enemies with the sun god in the past, as this would be a direct contradiction to everything we've been told. The giants of Elbaf love and revere the warrior god Elbaf, but they also love and revere the sun god. Both figures hold a very special place in their culture, which makes no sense if the sun god of the past was actually the sworn enemy of Elbaf. If that were the case, then Elbaf's quote-unquote arch-enemy, the sun god, would naturally have been viewed as a villainous figure for the giants of Elbaf, not a beloved deity who they also worship. It's the same way that the celestial dragons all hate the Davy clan today because Davy Jones was Emu's arch-enemy back in the second world. The fact that the giants of Elbaf today love both the warrior god Elbaf and the sun god suggests that their ancient rivalry was not one of hatred, and this is further supported by the fact that their prophecy is built around the union of the two fruit wielders. When the Nidhogg dragon rises in the sky, he will accompany the sun god. So all signs point to Elbaf and Joy Boy having had duels, but in the same vein of Roger and Whitebeard, with Elbaf and Joy Boy likely becoming friends after, as Oda has always done this with this dynamic throughout the story. This explains the shared reverence of both Elbaf and the sun god in giant culture. It explains the tale surrounding the Nidhogg user and the Nika user working together, and it even explains why Rox was so confident that a union between both fruit users would be unstoppable, because Rox knows history and he knows how that played out in the past. But so far I've been referring to the sun god user who rivaled Elbaf as being Joy Boy, but could it actually have been the sun god user from the first world? Meaning, could Elbaf himself been from the first world, or was it the second world? I believe the key to this answer lies in solving the mystery of Onigashima. Onigashima has long been one of the most fascinating mysteries in One Piece, with the simple question being, what could possibly have been this big in the past? A skull clearly of an ancient giant that is so absurdly big that it is essentially the size of a small island, housing Kaido's entire gigantic castle. This is far larger than Oars or any other ancient giant that we've seen in the story. So how could an ancient giant have ever grown to this size? And there is in fact a trifecta of mysterious objects in One Piece that hint at a giant of inexplicable size in the past. First, the previously mentioned Elbaf sword. second, the vast skull of Onigashima, and lastly, of course, the other titanic sword that lies alongside Onigashima. And this sword is obviously the weapon that the Onigashima giant in the past once wielded, since, well, there is obviously no one else big enough to wield it. And of course, the weapon would have been buried alongside its user. So these three signs all point to the existence of an ancient giant, or potentially two ancient giants in the past that grew to an unimaginable size. But it makes no sense how this could have happened. That is, up until now, with the revelation of a fruit that grows even ancient giants to unimaginable sizes. And here's where it gets interesting. Marco revealed that Onigashima was once called something else. It has only recently started to be called Onigashima. That's likely because in the past, this skull was simply referred to by the name of the actual being who the skull belongs to. Could this be the skull of Elbaf? And is that why Oda didn't reveal the true name of Onigashima right away? Could the skull have been so huge because Elbaf ultimately died here either in Nidhogg form or in hybrid form, thereby leaving his skeleton in its gigantic form? After all, we don't know exactly what happens to a Zoan user's body after it dies in its Zoan form. If Elbaf died here in his Nidhogg form, perhaps his skeleton remained supersized, but the dragon skull shape shifted back into its original ancient giant shape upon death. Or perhaps maybe Elbaf was fighting here in hybrid form, in which case his skull would have had its ancient giant shape from the start, but his bones would have remained supersized after death, with his skull remaining the size he was in hybrid form. And if you're still doubting that Onigashima was in fact the skull of an ancient giant user that had eaten the Nidhogg dragon fruit, well then the kicker is that Onigashima's name was not originally planned by Oda to be Onigashima. It was actually initially supposed to be called Ryugashima. Ryu means dragon. Essentially, instead of Demon Island, Oda was originally going to name this Dragon Island, but he decided to change it last minute. But with that in mind, if we put the pieces together, it all just makes so much sense. Onigashima is clearly the skull of an ancient giant, but the only way for ancient giants to become this big is by eating the Nidhogg dragon fruit. This also explains why these supersized swords are found at both Elbaf and next to Onigashima's skull, and it also explains why Oda initially even wanted to name Onigashima Dragon Island. And lastly, just think about how Oda even foreshadowed the whole concept about the truth of Onigashima from the get-go. I mean, Onigashima is the base of Kaido, and Oni, aka a mini ancient giant. And Kaido the Oni has eaten the Azure dragon fruit, which is a mini version of the Nidhogg dragon fruit. The entire concept of Kaido, this Oni who turns into a dragon, was foreshadowing the bigger truth about Onigashima itself in plain sight. Onigashima is the remains of an ancient giant who could turn into a legendary, gigantic dragon. Oda cheekily based Kaido in Onigashima because Kaido himself is essentially a miniature version of the skull's own story. And on top of that, Luffy's fight with Kaido, the sun god versus a dragon, was a callback to the ancient rivalry between the sun god user of the past and the warrior Elbaf. Luffy versus Kaido is just, a miniaturized version of that. That's also precisely why so much of Loki's story, from his introduction to falling from the sky and so on, is meant to directly call back to Kaido, because in the first place, Oda created Kaido as a prototype leading up to the main event, Loki. But with all this in mind, was Elbaf the only user of the Nidhogg fruit in the past, or was there a Nidhogg fruit user in both the first world and the second world? After all, there are two swords at two separate locations, and we know that there are two eras to uncover. And in that case, was Elbaf himself from the first world or the second world? I personally believe that Elbaf was from the second world, and was therefore Joy Boy's direct rival, as Jarl implies that Ragnar has not allowed anyone to eat the fruit since Elbaf died, meaning Elbaf was likely one world back from the current world. It's even possible that there was no Nidhogg fruit user in the first world, and rather the Nidhogg fruit came about in the second world, and therefore both swords at Elbaf and Wano belong to him. However, I definitely believe that the remains of Onigashima specifically were from the end of the second world, as it sounds like Wano was at the heart of the conflict of the Void Century, and Wano was even the land that Joy Boy was prophesied to return to. So whatever great war went down in the Void Century, it would make sense that Elbaf ultimately died at the center of that battle, fighting at the most important land of all, Wano. But let me know in the comments below if you believe Elbaf was from the first world or from the second world. And if you enjoyed this video, then definitely like and subscribe. And if you want to hear how Whitebeard foreshadows more of Elbaf's story, then you can listen to my weekly podcast that just came out by becoming a member or by supporting me on Patreon. Link in the description below.